Well, this is just something like that. No, I know. Yeah. He lives on the hop. I thought it was music. No, it doesn't hard. Yeah. Yeah. The only one that's not hard. I know. Because all the seniors are okay. They all think
They're all alone.
Thank you so much.
No.
Okay, we've got 1:30. Why don't we get started? Good afternoon, Research Methods. Wow, welcome to the end of week number 11. Who's ready for a weekend? Yay! All right, we're almost there, right? Almost ready to get some REM. When we come back on Monday, we'll be talking about complex designs. Let's give it up for complex designs. Yeah, all right. The video was posted just a few minutes ago, so it's out there on YouTube waiting for you. You'll be the first class to see that video. Look forward to that conversation. I'd like to start out today a little bit differently. First, we'll start out with a mantra. Can we all say this together? When I teach, I learn. Everybody? Wow, when I teach, I learn. So what we're going to do today is first see if you can sign on either to the S Drive or onto Blackboard and open up the article that we read for today and the one that you were doing your homework assignment on. The article analysis addressed this one, Treating Prejudice from Psychological Science. And what we're going to do, as you're calling that up, is we'll put you into pairs and we'll ask one member of the pair to pretend that you know nothing about this article and that you know nothing about research methods. So you're sort of a randomly selected student from the campus who has not taken research methods and you've not read this article. And we'll ask the other one of you to play teacher because when I teach, I learn. And what we'll do is we'll maybe break this up such that some people are teaching about experiment number 1, some are teaching about experiment number 2 or number 3 and so forth. And we'll have you play teacher to your naive student for maybe 5 minutes or so. Then I'll call our attention together and I'll ask you to switch. If you were the student early on, we'll ask you to play teacher and vice versa. And we'll spend maybe 5 minutes doing that. And then what we'll do is we'll bring the entire group back together and I'll pretend that I'm the randomly selected person off the street. I don't know anything about research methods. I've not read this. And we'll have you teach me about this, at least for a few minutes or so. We'll see how we do. Okay, so this is when I teach, I learn. So let's start to put you into pairs if we can. And I wonder if we can have the two of you be a pair. Okay, and we can have the two of you be a pair. Here's a pair. There's a pair. Okay, here's a pair. We'll do Rachel and Brittany as a pair. And then I guess we've got a trio back this way. All right? So the trio can work out as best you like who's going to play teacher, who's going to be the naive student. And can we do it this way too? If you're in the earliest part of this room, can we have you focus on experiment 1? Okay? Because you only have about 5 minutes to teach your other person, and we have 3 experiments. So we'll keep it manageable. Experiment 1, can we have maybe experiment 2 going here-ish? Experiment 3, and maybe we'll make you experiment, we'll do 2A. Okay, how about that? And somebody over here was 2B. Right? Who's ever doing 2 before, maybe you can do 2B. Right? 2B, 2A, 3s, 1s, or something like that. All right? It's okay if you pick a slightly different experiment, but get together with your partner, and one of you will play student, one of you will play teacher. Okay? Go ahead. We'll give you 5 minutes to get started on that. One more thing before you get too far. One more item before you get too far. You might want to explain to your student this in the context of the research cycle. Okay, so some of the details will make their way in, but if you can relate it back to the research cycle for your student, that would be great. Okay, go ahead.
Tolerant than like a positive they replaced the A and determined speed and to be the same. And
they just they were randomly allocated to
with the results in 2A. So, like
another group.
yeah, I'm like
We're still on teacher 1, student 1. We'll do that for about 3 more minutes. Okay, then we'll switch. Make sure you can tie back some details to this research cycle. Okay, over the next minute, begin to switch. You can finish your thoughts, but over the next minute or so, start to turn it around and change roles when you're at a convenient stopping point.
so too. Instead of doing so like they tried to like act oh, and looking so it was like positive, and then there was negative. How I can pick up on that. It's taken so long. Greater than imagining to it kind of found the same result.
But it wasn't.
Let's go for one more minute. Then we'll call us back into a big group.
No, but I'm going to. I'll probably be studying tomorrow. Their research and I studied like actual doing the research. Did they? Because I mean, they clearly did like an imagined type of thing, but did they not think that actually bringing someone in of that particular stigmatized group would elicit a different response? Is that?
So having somebody physically there.
Yeah.
Okay, well that could be a different variable. There are all different ways of operationalizing these things, right? So we can have, we can run the study with people of those characteristics, right? Maybe it's Muslim, maybe it's gay, maybe it's schizophrenic. You can actually bring in folks, or for practical reasons, maybe you can't. So you go to what you might imagine. Also, what's cool about the imagination bit is that you can do that almost anywhere, right? If we wanted to have Americans make improvement in how they perceive other groups, we could ask Americans to imagine versus trying to grab somebody from each of those groups and get them to every American. right. But yeah, lots of different ways to run these studies. Yeah? Okay, why don't we draw the line there? Why don't we see if we can get back into our big group? All right, and hopefully you found that instructive. Hopefully that was a achievable challenge. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll pretend that I'm a person randomly selected off of Broadway here on Granville, and I don't know anything about research methods, and I've not read this article, and I also haven't seen this thing. Okay, so I'll have one of you walk me through that. So I wonder if we might get a volunteer from, who worked with Experiment 1? Anybody here was at the front of the room, worked with Experiment 1? Is that this group? Which experiment did you work with?
I did 2A.
2A, and how about this group? 1? Okay, you did Experiment 1. Okay, so why don't we start out that way? Actually, we wouldn't have to start out that way. Okay, we could start with a different number. Would anybody like to start us out? Remember, it's really easy because I don't know anything, right? I mean, so if you were to say something incorrectly, I wouldn't know that about the article. I wouldn't know that about research methods. I mean, I'm just a sitting duck here. You could tell me anything, right? And this is not being graded. This is not being graded. Part of the challenge here is taking some information that you've gotten to be pretty good at and explaining it to a non-technical audience. This is one of the wonderful things, by the way, about PBS. If you've ever watched PBS, you know they can take some very technical ideas and make them accessible to a very broad audience. We're going to see if you can do that. I'm your broad audience. Anybody want to start out? Any volunteers? Even if you can only take us part of the way. Okay, well, thank you, Katie.
So we did 2B. Is that right? Yes. Okay, so
2B or not 2B?
So 2B was, and it was trying to, it was like an extenuation of 2A, which was, I guess for 2A, like in the real world situation, it was trying to find ways to eliminate like stigma against homosexual groups.
Okay.
And so the way they did that was they used this theory called the emotional processing theory, where they exposed a group of heterosexual students to like a negative situation, a negative condition situation with gay, like a negative experience with gay people,
Okay.
followed by a positive experience with gay people.
Okay.
And then in a separate group, they expose them to a positive condition,
Okay.
followed by another positive condition, and they found that the negative condition followed by the positive condition was more beneficial in eliminating anxiety towards homosexuals. And then for 2B, they used a different theory as a possible alternative explanation of the results.
Okay.
Using the contrast effects group or theory, which was like a positive followed by a positive.
Mm-hmm.
But they found that that explanation was not valid.
Okay.
And so the results showed that if you expose a group of people, whether the target group is straight men or gay men, that a negative exposure followed prior to a positive exposure is more beneficial in eliminating anxiety.
Okay. So we're trying to eliminate anxiety and stigma in this study that you read. And there's something called the emotional processing theory. And it said something about we have to invoke some negativity. So that's why you have a negative positive group. Did I understand correctly the negative positive group was actually more effective than the positive?
Yeah.
Okay. Seems backwards.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive.
Okay. Okay.
There was because in the emotional processing theory, there's this fear, you're activating this fear structure.
Okay.
So it's sort of counter, the positive is supposed to counter, when you see the contrast,
Mhm.
that's how you sort of counteract the
Okay.
anxiety.
Okay. Really good. Well, thank you. That was really very helpful. Anybody want to pick up on anything related to that experiment? Okay. Okay. Why don't we go on to maybe a different experiment, and people can feel free to harken back to this if they want. I'll play naive. I haven't even heard what Katie just told me, and Katie just did a very nice job explaining a lot about the study, and specifically about the particular one experiment that was there. It was experiment 2A, I think that one was. But okay, so somebody else maybe bring us through again, but we'll focus on a different one of the experiments. Anybody want to help us out with that? If you want to try to say it a little bit differently, that's fine. If you want to say it similarly, that's fine also. Any takers? Maybe we can relate it back to this one, which I don't know about. I usually have a random number generator. I just call somebody out, but no, no takers. You tell me. Did you find this to be? Was this difficult to explain to your neighbor? It was difficult to explain to your neighbor. What was the nature of the difficulty? Well, what made it hard? So you spin around and you're talking one-on-one. So now you're not talking to me, the stranger. You're talking to me, the professor. And just tell me what difficulty you had explaining it to the next person over. We'll go with Maren and then with Jenna.
I thought it was difficult when I was just doing it, for homework last night.
Okay. Right. So just reading that was difficult enough, and now all of a sudden, 12 hours ago you were the learner. Okay. Now you're teaching it to somebody, right? Okay. All right. Please go ahead. I'm sorry, I skipped over. I'll come back to Jenna.
No, it's fine. For me, it was a little bit difficult for the fact that, by the time you use number 3, you have to explain the other ones and then explain the variables in number 3 in order for it to make sense in complete context.
Ah, okay.
So it was kind of like being able to synthesize everything and then give the new information on how to that.
Okay. All right. So yeah, if your task is number 3. We set the stage a lot through this paper, building up to experiment number 3. So to come in sort of as the anchor person, right, in this relay race, it's a little bit difficult. Okay, that's a challenge. Jenna also had some challenges. We'll come back to Katie.
So I think the difficulty in explaining this kind of thing is that as psychology students, and especially as people who have gone through this and answered and gotten into
Yeah.
just having read the study
Mhm.
in its whole, but we also have an understanding of what exposure therapy is, probably even if it's just a basic understanding. And that's what this whole thing, that's like kind of the underlying context of this entire study. So trying to explain that to someone else, you have to start with, the way I started was, oh, well, in the real world, we have therapists treating anxiety disorders with exposing patients to what they're afraid of,
Mhm.
and then countering that with something more positive. So you have to start with that context
Yeah.
before you can explain
Okay.
anything else.
So that's an important point. Actually, in addition to having been in this class now, we're at the end of week number 11, 11 weeks here, you all had intro to psych, and we're pretending that I haven't had any of that stuff, okay? Now, you can imagine, some people go on to get their PhDs in psychology, right? So this is your second course for some of you. And for some of you, it's more than your second course. But now trying to explain to somebody on PBS what you do in your lab, or what kind of psychological research do you do, right? Okay. Well, we have to remember that the person to whom you are speaking probably has about as much context as the hypothetical person I was playing a moment ago, right? And now you're going to try to transfer, in this case, maybe 11 weeks in a semester's worth of information on a particular study in a way that's intelligible. This is extremely metacognitive, okay? So you have some cognition about what was happening. I think if I understand Marin's point, one challenge there is the cognition was difficult enough, right? I mean, just trying to get through all the technical jargon in these things and make some sense out of it. And now to try to explain that to somebody who's got less context is really a challenge. By the way, this is a major challenge that we have in science. Science has a communication problem. We spend years and years training people like you, and then they get finer and finer and finer in their details, and then we ask them to go on to PBS and explain to the audience what's going on in the laboratory, or with cancer research, or with depression research, or research on schizophrenia, or research on issues relating to social psychology, like stigma or intergroup conflict, this kind of a thing. And you're going to try to explain that in maybe just a few minutes to a lay audience. A really good challenge, but I hope that you're appreciating some of that difficulty and also grappling with it, making some progress on it. Okay? Something else that you had difficulty, that you found difficult when you were explaining it to your student. I think I saw a couple of other hands go up. What else made this challenging? Okay, yeah, thanks, Mike.
Well, like, I had experiment 3, and I kind of, like, I had to draw on, like, the first and second to, like, explain how we got to the third, like, how we're
Okay.
using, what we're using in experiment 3.
Okay.
And then there's so many, like, different, like, terms that, like, little things that we're using within it that I knew all of them. I just, like, got a little bit, I tried to explain this, and then I explained something, like, too early.
Yeah,
And
okay.
I didn't explain something that, like,
Okay.
helped them understand that
Uh-huh.
thing. And it was
Right.
kind of like, I had to go back and forth a lot.
Yeah, it's an important part of teaching. Teachers spend a lot of time thinking about how am I going to lay this out, right, so that it's actually coherent to somebody who's not seen it before. One last note that I'll make about this is some of you will choose to go on to do a 200-level research pairing after this course. You'll take some topical course in psychology, and you'll take the paired research course. At the end of that course sequence, you'll be over in Burton Morgan, and you'll make a semester-end poster presentation. And you will have spent a good portion of the semester on a project, and you'll be asked to give an overview to a naive person, and again, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So you're going to take maybe 7 or 8 weeks worth of work and try to boil it down to a coherent 4-minute presentation to somebody who really hasn't been working on that at all, right? They might not know your topic at all. So this is a recurring problem. I'm glad that we've grappled with it today. It's a communication issue, but it also helps us learn what it is we need to learn a little bit more tightly. Okay, any other comments or questions about this exercise or the article in general? Brittany had an excellent comment earlier. So the manipulation here was one that was imaginal, right? And they left it fairly vague too. They said, so imagine that you have a negative experience, and it might be tense, it might be uncomfortable, that kind of thing. And then imagine that you have a positive experience, which is not tense and it's relaxed and so forth. She talked about the possibility of actually bringing in a member, if I understood your question, bringing in a member from the groups of interest. So we had a group that was the people with schizophrenia, we had gay people, and we had British Muslims. I think were the 3 groups in this particular. So why not bring in those folks rather than just imagine those kinds of things? Any ideas why the researchers might have chosen to go the way that they did with this imaginal? Yeah, please go.
There would be like
Okay, it's less risk. Okay, so it's less risky maybe for all parties involved, right? And so it probably also goes through the IRB more easily, which isn't necessarily a reason to do research. I think I saw a couple of other hands. Kip had one and maybe Natalie? No, okay, maybe not Natalie. Go ahead, Kip.
I was showing a picture that they get more like a representation of their own feelings instead of like seeing a person. So they'll just kind of like project their opinions on the group by having a picture instead of an actual person.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, if we just refer to the group, then your mental image of that group might be different from Jenna's, and we really want to be working with your own memory of what that group might be like. Is that the idea?
Yeah, if
Okay.
you just refer to the group, then you get like how the subject or the participant feels about the group.
Okay.
You actually bring in like a real person.
Uh-huh.
Maybe they'll meet the person, like not tell you like their actual opinions on the group. Just like
Okay.
the person.
Okay, please go ahead. Yeah.
My thing, like, I understand this, it's easily, like, if you're able to disseminate to more people when you do it. in a
Okay.
way that allows
Okay.
you to do it online and stuff like
Right.
that. But I just wonder if, a problem that I have with it is if someone comes into the study or does a study that doesn't have prior knowledge, let's say they don't have prior knowledge of like a British Muslim or they don't have the image in their mind.
Okay.
Or if they, and if that's the case, if they're just fueling their image off of just assumptions.
Yeah. Sure. Okay.
This is something that I was thinking about is like reading, especially the third one, because you're never, and I was talking about this with Rachel like you, someone that's overtly a British Muslim may or may not be able, easy to like distinguish.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not easy to distinguish someone who has schizophrenia or
Yeah.
gay.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to really like, they might be like the stereotypical gay person or the stereotypical person with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Kind of like might make their initial, like, even their response at first is probably going to be something that may be outlandish if they're thinking the way that society portrays
Certainly.
people.
That's a very good point. Right, so one of the challenges becomes, okay, we want to know something about intergroup relations maybe, and how do we reduce stigma? And so we get this challenge, and how is it that we operationalize this? And we operationalize the group by offering these imaginal situations. Now that's potentially loaded with all kinds of problems. Then you could bring in one person, but that person may or may not be representative of the group. Groups are very multidimensional. So this person might be representative of the group on 3 of several dimensions, but not on the other dimension. So it's very difficult to really get at the real world in some kind of manageable manner. And this is usually why we need so many different kinds of research methods and different kinds of experiments, that over many, many experiments and observations, we get to some general idea about how we might improve real-world relations on these intergroup conflict kinds of things. So we have to do it one study at a time. Any one study is never going to get us there. Okay, thank you all for participating in that. Why don't we do this? Why don't we see if we can have you open up now our data set from last Friday, and we'll see if we can begin making a different kind of connection to what we've been talking about in class. We've been talking about the one way within subject Anova. Can we all yell this out? When we say one way, what does that mean? One independent variable, right? So coming up on Monday, we're all getting excited about the opportunity to talk about complex designs where we have more than one independent variable. For those of you who are still looking for this data set is going to be out on the S drive, and this is in the practice folder, practice problems. And if you go to the practice problems, all the way on the bottom, there's going to be an SPSS data set there. You can click on that. It'll take a moment for that to come up. SPSS is a little bit slow. But we actually ran this test that can be construed a few different ways last Friday. This particular test, we're going to do a one-way ANOVA on it. And we'll look at some data. And then maybe we'll do some post-hoc tests on that, because we haven't really worked all the way through that. We want to make sure that people are comfortable doing that. So first, let's just see how many people can find this data set. Got that one going on there? And if you can help your neighbor find that, if your neighbor hasn't already found it. So this is practice problems, the very bottom file. I think people have it. If you do have it, can you raise your hand? Okay, I think that's the whole gang. Okay, everybody's got that. All right, so can somebody remind us, I'll give you a little hint, just how did this experiment go? There's a hint. We did this last Friday. We looked for the dot.
And sometimes they were green squares or blue squares or blue dots, and they got never defined.
All right, that's a very nice description. There's our green dot, that's our target. And we have this green dot, sometimes it's there, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we get you responding yes, sometimes you'll be responding no. And then we have different set sizes. Sometimes the green dot appears among just a couple of distractors, or maybe 4 of them, and then sometimes it's 16 distractors, sometimes it's 64 distractors. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it isn't. The distractor set itself is sometimes very similar to the target, and sometimes it's really quite different from the target. Okay? And when it's quite different, we call this kind of a search, as you can see down at the bottom, the feature search, which is usually quite easy. That's the feature search. When we have to look at the conjunction of features, we have to look at this being both green and circular, as opposed to maybe a green square or a blue circle, then that usually tends to slow us down. So what we're going to do is we're going to now do a one-way ANOVA inside of SPSS. And I think we did one of these earlier, but we haven't connected it to our own data. So now we get to look at the data that you took last Friday, and we'll see what kinds of information SPSS produces for us. Does anybody remember how we get this analysis going? Is that a general question, or?
No.
Okay, how do we get the analysis going?
Oh, you go to the
Analyze, okay. Let's all do that.
to compare means.
Okay, we could compare means because we are in fact comparing means. We're going to do something a little bit different, and I mentioned this on the video. We're going to go to general linear model, which is something we've not done previously. Okay, general linear model. How many people find that? And here's where it gets just a little bit confusing. I wish they didn't do this. There's general linear model, and beneath that there's generalized linear models. Okay, we want the one on top, general linear model. Okay, and you get a submenu, and one of the options there is repeated measures. How many people see the repeated measures submenu? I'm going to go that far and not click on it, but I'm going to ask you to click on it. I'll leave that up there just so everybody can see it. Okay, so this one's a little bit different. Meg was correct. We are going to be comparing means, right? And we're going to compare means in these. We'll take 3 conditions. We'll do a one-way ANOVA. Maybe we'll look at the conjunction absent condition. So this is where you're looking for this guy amidst a bunch of, we'll say, green squares and blue circles, something like that. Okay? And we have either 4, 16, or 64 targets there, or distractors there, rather. So let's click on repeated measures, and we come to this. How many people get that far? Okay, all right, really good. Now what we're going to do is name our factor. A factor will be used now interchangeably with the word independent variable. So why don't we say that we have something like set size as our variable, and we're going to compare conjunction absent 4 to conjunction absent 16 to conjunction absent 64. We're going to call this thing set size because what's really varying across those is whether we have 4, 16, or 64 distractors. Okay? And we're going to ask to what extent does reaction time, that's what we were measuring last time around, does that change across those 3 levels of our independent variable, which is how big the set size is. How many levels do we have? 3 levels. Okay? So we're just going to go that far, set size 3, and then this add button becomes clickable. And we can click on that, and now we have entered into our general linear model, which is a little bit awkward in how we talk about a repeated measures design, but that's how we're going to do it. And we have 3 levels here. How many people have that much?
Wait, sorry, how do we know that we have 3 levels?
Okay, good. So of the many, we could do any number of analyses here. The one that we're going to analyze just for today is we're going to compare 4 to 16 to 64. Let me point up this way, if that helps. We're going to do conjunction absent 4 to 16 to 64. Okay? So those are the ones that we're going to be looking at. There are 3 of them. We could have done just these 2. We could have done just these 2, but we're going to do these 3. Okay? All right, let's go define. And we get a menu that looks like this, and I'll make sure everybody's on board with that. If you get a menu that looks like this, can you raise your hand? Okay, so now this thing is ready to do a 3-level analysis within this one variable. And we can put in any 3 that we want, but we really want to be careful here to look at exactly what's being input. And so I'm going to click on conjunction absent 4, and I'll slide that one over. I'll click on conjunction absent 16, I'll slide that one over. And conjunction absent 64. So again, what's going on here is we're trying to find this target, and it's now going to be amidst some blue circles and maybe 1 green square, something like this. Okay? So there are, in this particular case, 4 distractors, and then we could also have 16 distractors or 64 distractors. Who's following that? This is actually, though, the case when these distractors are there, but in this particular case, the target itself is absent. and you would have to report, no, I didn't see that. Please go ahead, Rachel.
Are we doing, instead of just doing like the compare means, are we doing it this way so that we can kind of select the means that we're going to compare?
Yeah, under compare means, you actually won't get the option to do a repeated measures ANOVA. You can do, under compare means, you can do a between subject ANOVA, but you can't do a repeated measures ANOVA. We have to go this route in order to do that. Does that help? So we're still comparing means, and that's a little confusing that they created a menu that was called generalized linear model, but that's how they've created it, okay? All right, so let's do a couple of other things. Why don't we click on options, okay? And I'll ask us to highlight both of these. It sort of defaults to clicking on overall, and then set size. If you can click on that as well by holding down the shift key and selecting both of those, and we'll get means on all of that. Okay, so we'll slide that over and we'll get some means. Okay. I'll also ask us to start developing a habit. Some of these pieces of information we're going to click on won't mean a whole lot to us just now, but I'll ask us to get in the habit of doing this. Can we click these first three? Descriptive statistics, we know what that is. Estimates of effect size, I'll pause for a moment. Who remembers hearing about effect size? Okay, anybody want to yell out an indicator of effect size, if you recall one? Cohen's d, okay? So we could get some kind of index like Cohen's d or some other index of that. And then observed power. Anybody remember hearing about power? Anybody want to tell us what that might be, if you recall? Statistical power, right? So what do we mean by statistical power? The ability to find an effect if it's there, okay? Right, the ability to find an effect if it's there. So we'll get in the habit, we won't spend a lot of time on that today, but we'll get in the habit of checking those three. Okay? How many people have that much? Okay? We can say continue. So now we've set up which variables we're going to analyze. We've said we'd like some descriptive statistics and a few other things in the output. And then we'll click on OK, and we'll let this thing whirl for just a little bit. And we'll get a screen that looks something like that. And by a show of hands, how many people get that far? Okay? All right. I'm going to remain quiet just for a moment, and I'll let you plug around on these different options. You can click over here, and you can see, for example, what the within subject box says, what the descriptive box says. I'll let you plug around, and you tell me how you think we should proceed with our analysis. I'll give you a moment to play, and then maybe you can tell me what would be a good first click, given what we've talked about previously. I will tell you that there's actually way more information here than you need. You won't need all of this. So part of the task here is winding our way through, figuring out what's relevant, given some of the things we mentioned previously. Kip, would you like to start us off?
I think first you look at Auschwitz test this.
Wonderful. Let's go there. Okay, thank you very much. So remember that when we're doing a one-way within subject ANOVA, we have this two-step process, similar to the other two-step process that we have. We evaluate an assumption, and then we test the null hypothesis. Of course, the null hypothesis here, as always, is all means are equal, which is why Meg was correct in saying we do want to compare means. It's just that we can't use the compare means menu, unfortunately. Anything you want to share with us about sphericity, Kip?
Well, the sig value is less than 0.05.
Okay.
Which should lead you to reject the sphericity.
Okay, all right. So we're going to be rejecting the sphericity assumption. Who's okay with that much? Did we lose anybody there? Okay. Okay. All right. So let's take one step at a time there, Rachel. Are we okay that we have to evaluate an assumption? Does that work? Okay. Are we okay that because this happens to be a within subject analysis, it's a sphericity assumption as opposed to an equal variance assumption? So far, so good? Okay. And the name of that happens to be Mauchly versus Levine, would have been the corresponding one from last week. Okay. Then Kip correctly came over to the sig value because we always evaluate things using a sig value. And we have only one rule in the class about that. And if it's less than 0.05, we reject something. If it's greater than 0.05, we retain something. So now what's being evaluated is the assumption. It's called the sphericity assumption. And we have to reject the sphericity assumption, okay, because it's less than 0.05. How's that? All right. Anybody else? Does that work? Okay. So now we're off to the races. Thank you, Kip. Anybody have a good next move? Okay. Why don't we go with Natalie? Okay, we're going to drop down one box. This is called Test of Within Subject Effects. And Natalie correctly brought us to what I'll call line 2, and she also called greenhouse geyser. What happens here? Any idea?
Yeah, we look at the sig value for the
Okay, how do we do?
well, we reject the null hypothesis.
Okay, so even though we had a sphericity violation, it turns out that we still can reject the null hypothesis. There was some kind of a correction that was made according to these statisticians, who are called Greenhouse-Geyser, and they played around maybe with the degrees of freedom. Maybe they did so by a scaling factor of 0.55, if that works for us. And I won't ask you to do that math in your head, but really what we essentially need to extract from this is that this is a sig value. And as it turns out, in this particular case, and I didn't plan this, these were the data that you took last Friday. Everybody was in the room plugging away on this thing. Right? It turns out that no matter which of the adjustments you would have made, you would have wound up significant. Who's following that? Okay. Somebody just remind us what that means in this case, that we have a significant value here, either in Greenhouse-Geyser or in any of the others. What does that tell us generally about what's going on in our analysis? There's a Sesame Street song about this. One of these things is not like the other. So that is to say that we're measuring reaction time as you're trying to find that target. And we have either 4, 16, or 64 targets out there, and we seem to be generating very different reaction times. Just out of curiosity, why don't we dial back up, and maybe we can see some means floating around here. Way up top, we get some descriptive statistics from the first week of class. We're getting some central tendency. We're getting some dispersion. When we had just 4 items up here, kind of like what you see this way, people were responding on average in 844 milliseconds. Okay, that's how long it took you to come to the conclusion there was nothing there. And you hit the, nope, it's not here button. Okay? But if we had the same kind of layout with 16 distractors as opposed to 4, now you're up to 1,302 milliseconds. Who's following that? Okay? So that cost you maybe another roughly 500 milliseconds. Okay, so we put up a few more distractors, and on average that cost the class 500 milliseconds. And then we go up to 64 distractors, and we're up to something on the order of almost another full second, right, from where we were at 16. So we clearly are slowing down as the set size is getting larger and larger. Who's finding that? Okay, is that working for us? Okay, and you can see the corresponding standard deviations. Some of the standard deviations are quite large, okay, but clearly there's a big mean difference as well. All right. All right. So one of these things is not like the others. It might be that 4 is really generating a difference from 16, or 4 from 64. How would we figure out which pairs are different from which? Any ideas about that? So one of these things is not like the others. We call that the omnibus F. Tells us that somewhere there's at least one difference. Thanks, Jenna. Okay, we want to use post-hoc tests, and unfortunately SPSS can't do those for us directly. So now what we want to do is run a series of t-tests to figure out where the differences are. And let's just remind ourselves what the conditions were. The conditions were essentially a set size of 4, a set size of 16, and 64. Who's okay with that? Okay. So what we might want to do is this t-test. We might want to do this t-test. We might want to do that t-test. Does that work for us? All the pairwise comparisons. 4 versus 16, 16 versus 64, and 4 versus 64. Who's okay with that? All right. Anybody remember how we do t-tests around here? Inside of SPSS. Can we call that out? How do we get the t-test going? We've done this once before, but it's been a little while. It's a type of analysis. Analyze, compare means. Okay, so now we're back to what Meg was suggesting was intuitive. Okay, compare means. Okay, actually that was a good guess, but it isn't a one sample t-test. Okay, that would be another good guess, but that's okay. What would it mean if we did independent samples t-tests? What would that imply? Anybody want to help us out? So that it would imply that one group was over here, one group was over here, and one group was over here. But each of you received all levels of the independent variable, and somewhat confusingly, they label this here as being a paired samples t-test. Okay, so we call this a paired samples. Sorry that some of these names inside of SPSS are counterintuitive. Let's click on paired samples. So that's analyze, compare means, paired samples. Right? And we come to a menu that looks like this. And I'm going to make it really, really big and wide. And I'm going to see just by a show of hands how many people got that far. Does that work for us? Okay. So now what we can do is we can plug in variable 1 and variable 2 so we can compare those on our t-test. So why don't we click on, it was conjunction absent 4, we'll slide that one over, versus 16. And we'll pause this for a moment there. That's one of our pairs that we're comparing. This This one right here, 4 versus 16. Who's okay with that? Okay. Now we're going to stay in the conjunction absent family, but we're going to do 4 versus 64. That's one possible pair. It doesn't really matter which sequence you put these in. 4 versus 64. And then what's our last possible pair? Can we all yell it out? Think I hear it? 16 versus 64. Okay. So, and by the way, if yours is reversed relative to mine, that's okay. We really just want to compare the two. We don't care which one is going first or second. We might need to figure that out later, but right now those are the 3 pairwise possibilities. Who's okay with all of that? Okay. Before we go ahead and hit enter, we'll see if there's any confusion at any point here in the room. Anybody confused about how we got this far? We ran in Anova. We had 3 levels in our one variable, and we found there was a huge effect somewhere because after the sphericity corrections, we were significant at the 0.001 alpha level. Okay. Now we're going to try to pinpoint where that is. We've identified some pairwise comparisons. How many pairwise comparisons have we made? 3. Okay. So there's a pair, there's a pair, there's a pair. 3 different pairs. Please go ahead.
Wait, so when we use the Post-Hoc when we reject sphericity.
Okay, so it's not that we rejected sphericity, right? We did reject sphericity, but that's not why we use the Post-Hoc test. We're trying to evaluate where the differences are in our means. Remember that we found that we had this huge effect in our within subjects analyses. We went to the greenhouse Geyser line and we rejected the null hypothesis. Does that work for us? So that tells us at least one of the means is different from at least one of the others. So far, okay? So now we're trying to figure out which particular pair or pairs might be different.
So when we reject the null,
That's when we come to this far, right? Okay? Very good. Please go ahead.
So you do the paired samples t-test when all the participants experience all levels of the variable?
Perfect. That's exactly right. And another way of saying that is when you have a within subject design, which is what we're working on this week. In our article, by the way, there was some within subject variables and then some between subject variables, interestingly. Okay, who's ready for all this? Ready to hit the OK button? Let's let it rip, see what we get. Bunch of t-tests, and it says paired samples t-test coming out here. Okay, and let you take a look at the output for paired samples t-test. Anybody want to tell us how they made some sense out of this? How do they interpret this output? I'll let you look it over. So we're looking just at the paired samples t-tests. Okay, why don't we take it one at a time? How did we do when we compared, let's see, it was conjunction absent 4 versus conjunction absent 16. So we did that pair. We compared 2 means in this t-test. What did we do? Retain or reject? Reject? How many people would like to reject? How many people are not sure what they want to do yet? Okay, so hopefully everybody's rejecting because that value looks that way. If we go to the next pair, which was 4 versus 64, we're also rejecting there. And the final pair was 16 versus 64. So it turns out that all of these pairs were different from each other, at least nominally. Who's following that? Okay, so these were quite different from each other, except for one thing. We actually have to make a correction. Anybody remember how we make a correction in the within subject world? It's not Chaffee, it's not Tukey, it's not Dunnett. Bonferroni. How did that go? How did that little song go? Yeah. Yeah, we're going to call it. How do we do the Bonferroni correction?
The number of tests
by something. Okay, and specifically this probability, the probability of a type 1 error. So can we all do this in our heads? 3 times 0 is? 0. By contrast, 3 times 0 is? 0. And by strong contrast, 3 times 0 is? 0. So if we make the Bonferroni correction, we have this t-test thing going on here. Here are these bars. We now move them out further than Bonferroni. We still reject the null hypothesis because even after multiplying by 3, we're still less than 0.05. Who's okay with that? Okay, so we made a Bonferroni correction. It turned out not to have mattered here, but we did it, and we now have statistical significance even after the Bonferroni correction. Who's following all of that? Any questions? Have a great weekend. Okay.
So did we,
That's good.
did we figure out which pair was the significantly different one, or did it say that they weren't? All of them.
All of them were. This one differed from this one with a sig value equaling 0, 0, 0. After the Bonferroni correction, it equaled 0, 0, 0. This one different from that one, this one different from that one. So in this particular case, they were all different from each other. Okay? Have a great weekend.